So we're continuing on with the 12 disciples of the English Bible. And as you can see from the red circle, tonight is the focus on Miles Coverdale. And many people have heard at least one time or another of the Coverdale Bible. And it's quite famous in England, of course. And so we're going to unwrap that whole story just a bit for everyone tonight. But before we actually even get there, let's do a little review to catch us up for where we are. If we remember now, things have gotten quite gloomy and quite tragic in the last several weeks. We've finally gotten to a point where the established church, the state church, is so much in bed with the monarchies over all of Europe, including England, that they have been burning and continue to burn people at the stake for threatening their power structure. And of course, William Tyndale, our hero for being the man who translated from the original languages and being such a prodigy that having spoken and written in and being a scholar of 8 different languages, he is our hero of the English Bible. And of course, they strangled him and burned him at the stake for that when they caught him finally. And then we told that whole story. And then John Rogers, we mentioned last week, and how John Rogers had also been caught up in that. And he came up with the Matthew's Bible, which was the completion of Tyndale's work and published as a whole Bible in 1537, and he was burned at the stake by whom? Bloody Mary, right? So, before we get to Coverdale, we need to back up just a little bit. All of this is sort of taking place at the same time period, within the same few decades. But if we back up a couple of decades back from Miles Coverdale, when he was just a young man, this is the best picture that we have of a man named Robert Barnes. He was a priest, and he was a scholar, and he was a leader in the Cambridge area, and he had gone over to the continent and had gone to Switzerland and had been introduced to the Vetus Latina, the old Latin Bible. And he realized how different it was from their Vulgate Bible. And he brought it back, and they started studying it in secret study groups, actually in a pub. And that they were pretty sure that nobody from the establishment would be in their local pub. So that's where they started studying the Bible together. It was Robert Barnes leading it, Miles Coverdale, and several of his cohorts in students were studying that, and that's going to become important when we actually get to Miles in a few minutes. But this was the Anabaptist Bible, the Vetus Latina, the old Latin. And it had notes in it from the Syriac Peshitta, the original Aramaic, and it was explaining those things that were crucial in the doctrines or false doctrines of the church. And so he also, you'll notice down here, I've circled the Bible, but also he had in his possession some of the writings of Martin Luther. And so, of course, it was outlawed by the king and by the clergy, the state church, so to speak, to be a Lutheran. You could not do that. And so he was brought up, Robert Barnes was brought up in front of Cardinal Wolsey. Now, you'll notice there in parenthesis I've got Wolsey. That's what Tyndale called him. He said, whenever Tyndale was talking about Cardinal Wolsey, he said, "Oh, Cardinal Wolsey's got himself another lamb." And so he had a little sense of humor, dark humor there. So when Robert Barnes was brought up before him, he would not go against a sermon that he had preached that was questioning some of these things of the church at that time that was in power. And so they brought him up again, and I'll read this because he was Coverdale's mentor and a priest, and he gets an honorable mention. In 1526, Barnes was brought before the vice-chancellor. Now that's the vice-chancellor for religious affairs. Henry and all the other kings and queens had vice-chancellors for all different things, and there was a vice-chancellor for religious affairs, for preaching a heretical sermon and committed to Fleet Prison, but afterwards conditionally released to the Austin Friary in London. Although under house arrest, Barnes was allowed visitors. It was subsequently discovered that while incarcerated there, Barnes was secretly a distributor of illegal copies of William Tyndale's New Testament. He was condemned and burned at the stake. And so this is a picture of them being brought before the council and being accused of having a Bible that was not approved, even for priests, and Martin Luther's letters that weren't approved. And so you'll notice there, from this picture from Fox's Book of Martyrs, there's really 6 people there on their knees. And a very interesting story, tragically interesting, when they were all brought to the execution place, 3 of them were Protestant reformers, including Barnes, and 3 of them were Catholics. And the Catholics, because we were in this time period where Henry had just made himself the king and the leader of the Church of England, then Catholicism and certain things about Catholicism weren't tolerated anymore. And at the same time, there were 3 guys that were Protestants. They accused them of Lutheranism, and they were burned at the stake too. So you had Protestants and Catholics all burned at the stake. Well, not all of them burned at the stake on the same day, executed on the same day. The Catholics were actually charged with treason because they were being treasonous against the king as the head of the church. So that's why the Catholics were executed. But Catholics were executed differently for treason than for heresy. For treason, what you got was hanged, drawn, and quartered. And so the Catholics were hanged, and then they were drawn, which means took out all their intestines, and then they were quartered. They tied them to 4 horses and sent the horses in 4 different directions and pulled their bodies apart. And so that's what hang, drawn, and quartered means. And so those 3 guys got that. The other 3 were simply burned at the stake. So this is what was happening. This is not, I've got 12 disciples of the English Bible that we're having our focus about, but it was happening to hundreds of people in England and on the continent during these times. It was a super inquisition that was happening because of Lutheranism and all of the Anabaptist influence that was going on. Now to Coverdale and his background. Let's get to know Coverdale just a little bit. He was born in York, England in 1488. Then he was ordained as a priest at Cambridge in 1514. He became an Augustinian friar in Cambridge in 1515. So that's the time period, and that's, of course, Martin Luther was doing his thing, the Wittenberg door was happening, the time frame, and all of that on the continent. So this was a time of great religious and social upheaval in England and on the continent. In 1525, he secretly began studying the writings of Martin Luther and the Vetus Latina. So there's your connection there, under Robert Barnes. In 1528, he began to preach against the practices of the worship of sacred images, confession to a priest, and transubstantiation. And so when he began to start preaching against these things, he was preaching against the Catholic Church, which, if you remember, all of the people that were priests and cardinals and all, they were either secret Catholics that had said we're going to be Church of England Catholics, but they were still not strictly Protestants. And so he was threatened with imprisonment and possibly burning, and so he fled to Antwerp in Holland on the continent. Now, a little bit more about him and his background and his aptitudes. Coverdale read and spoke Latin and German, but little Hebrew or Greek. He was mostly the editor for Tyndale and aided him with Martin Luther's text emendations. So he understood Latin and German very well, so he could help with all of the Germanic things, commentary that Martin Luther came up with, and that the people in the Lutheran Church were discussing through and comparing the actual Hebrew and Greek. And so he was able to do that through his scholarly knowledge of German and Latin. His greatest asset at that time was that he was not wanted officially and could move about to aid Tyndale. He could come and go because he was a priest. He could say he's coming for Tyndale's confession. When Tyndale was for 10 months, he was in Vilvoorde Castle under house arrest before they burned him, and they actually did some more translations of the Old Testament during that time to try and get it as far along as they could. So this was no small help to Tyndale for Coverdale to be able to do that. Of course, theologian and scholar C.S. Lewis wrote, "Compared to Tyndale, Coverdale was a rowboat to a battleship." But of course, you have to remember, C.S. Lewis was an Oxford man, and he was from, Coverdale was from Cambridge. So, you have to give him a little bit of grace there. But compared to Tyndale, of course, almost anybody's a rowboat, right? And those of us, I'm floating around on a life preserver compared to that. So, historians often tend to treat Coverdale and Tyndale like competitors in a race to complete the monumental and arduous task of translating the biblical text. One is often credited to the exclusion of the other. In reality, they knew each other, occasionally worked together. Contemporary historian John Fox stated that they were in Hamburg translating the Pentateuch together as early as 1529. So let's not say Coverdale was great and Tyndale wasn't so great, or vice versa. They were both using their own gifts that God had given them and working together during a very tense and stressful time in their lives. Both exiles under the thumb of the state church, but because Miles fled before he was charged with anything, he wasn't a wanted man, so he could run around and do things that Tyndale and some of the others could not do. So later on, as he was developing himself and realizing his call, he studied Hebrew day and night, or night and day. Coverdale translated the remainder of the Old Testament, the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, etc., from Luther's Bible. So that's how he was able to do the translating. Luther had used Hebrew and Greek, and so with Coverdale having great scholarship in Latin and German, he could go ahead and take that German and put it into English. But he did do some great things that we need to understand. He did coin quite a few phrases that we would never have had, such as he coined the phrase loving kindness when it got to the Psalms. God is always being said of in the Psalms that he comes to us with loving kindness, but it wasn't that in the German. It was kind love. And it didn't really give us what we wanted emotionally from that phraseology about God. And some of you all may know this is an old mountain hymn. By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Psalm 137:1. Anybody remember that? Well, I'm the only one. Okay. But in German, what it said there was, in Babylon by the river we sat and wept. And so, you know, Germans are bottom line people, right? And they go word for word and not necessarily meaning for meaning. So it's correct. In Babylon, by the river, we sat and wept. All right, we got the picture. But Coverdale says, by the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Isn't that much more of a visceral kind of phraseology? Well, he did that throughout all the Psalms, Proverbs, the writings, etc., which gave us what we have today as a real love for the Psalms in English. This is a cover page from that. In 1534, the Canterbury Convocation petitioned Henry VIII that the whole Bible might be translated into English. Thus encouraged, in 1535, Coverdale dedicated his complete Bible to the king. And here's another connection. The place of the first printing of the Coverdale Bible was Antwerp. The printing was financed by Jacobus van Meteren. The printing of the first edition was finished on 4 October 1535. So who was Meteren? Remember, he was the father-in-law to John Rogers. John Rogers had met his daughter there when he was printing the Matthew's Bible and married her. And then there's another unsung hero, Jacobus van Meteren. He supported all of this with his printing presses and his heart. And so we have lots and lots. God has always got a people. People are willing to sacrifice their time, talent, and treasure for the Lord. And most of us go totally unknown to the world. That's okay. We're known because our names are written in the book, right? In 1538, Henry VIII allowed the Coverdale Bible to be printed in England, and it was called the Great Bible. So that's why sometimes you'll have different numbers, year numbers for different things that happen in the Bible or happen in Christian history. You'll find that people will say, oh, the Coverdale Bible was from 1535. And others will say, no, 1538. Well, it was both. It was both and. It was printed first in Antwerp on the continent by Jacobus van Meteren, but it wasn't allowed in England yet. And that, you'll notice 1535, that's a year before Tyndale was burned at the stake. It was October 1536 that he was burned at the stake. So all this was going on, going back and forth, and Coverdale was trying to finish everything up, and Tyndale, he was helping Tyndale, but Tyndale couldn't get out of prison. And so finally, he finished it. He put it on the presses, and they were trying to smuggle it into England. But they weren't having a whole lot of success. It had really clamped down. But in 1538, finally, Henry, being happy, being successful, having a male heir, he was happy. He said, yeah, let's go ahead. I'm the head of the church, and the Pope hadn't got me yet, so let's go ahead and have a Bible for England, and we'll take that great Bible. And he didn't know much about it, but he didn't care. So, now this is dedicated to Ralph tonight. The Johannine comma. I wanted to just say, this is what the pages look like. I know you can't read it very well. You couldn't read it very well if it was clear because it's Middle English. But the Johannine comma, just to give you a little example of what we were talking about last week or so, there's this phrase that's the Johannine comma. For there are three which bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these three are one. That's what it is in the yellow here. For there are three which bear record in heaven. Can you make that out if I help you with it? And so these are the words that some people have left out. Well, now why? People have said, all right, if it's supposed to be in the Bible, why is it in parenthesis here? Well, it's in parenthesis because in Middle English, that's what they always did. They always, for something that they were going to mention within a mention, kind of like what we do with our semicolon and then whatever comes after a semicolon, they would put it in these parentheticals. And the higher critics came along later and said, well, this is in parentheticals. It's not supposed to be there because it's not there in a lot of the old documents. And what we find when we study it, we find that Origen and his people who were trying to placate the Arians and keep everything together in the church started excising out of the new copies that were made, excising this out. Because the Arians did not want, they said that God was supreme and Jesus could not be fully God even though he was fully man. And so they were saying there's two separate people here. And this said that they are one. Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Holy Spirit, that they are one. So they excised this. But if you go back to the Greek, you'll find that, the Greek saying right down here, there's the Spirit, water, and the blood, and these three are one. That one right there is four Greek words. Eis to ein eisen, which almost sounds German, doesn't it? But what it means is, in Greek, are in agreement with. Are in agreement with. Not in agreement, not are one. And so what it means is, when Jesus was baptized, he was baptized and the Spirit came and sponsored that baptism. And Jesus was the blood, and he was baptized in water. So it's Jesus' baptism was a representation. His coming to the earth, coming to the world, was authorized by God because of the three things that connect us to God. The Spirit of God, the blood that is in us, and the water we're baptized in. Make sense? That's what he's talking about here. But he's talking about here based on here. So what can these three be in agreement with if you don't have these? That doesn't make any sense in the Greek if you drop the Johannine comma. Anyway, that's a lot of theology. That's extra credit tonight, but we're just going to blame it on Ralph. All right. So if anybody ever comes to you and says, what's a Johannine comma about? You now know. This is really a wonderful thing about Coverdale and why he's one of the 12 disciples of the English Bible. He had stick-to-itiveness. He kept on and kept on and kept on. Based on Coverdale's translation of the book of Psalms in his 1535 Bible, his later Psalter has remained in use in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer to the present day. In other words, it wasn't excised ever since 1662. The Book of Common Prayer to the present day is retained with various minor corrections in the 1926 Irish Book of Common Prayer, the 1928 U.S. Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, and the 1962 Canadian Book of Common Prayer. So all of the prayers based on the days that you would have in a calendar that you would pray the Psalter came because of all the translation of Miles Coverdale. And that's got a lot of longevity to it. If you wrote something today and somebody 300 years later, 400 years later, were still repeating it by a lot of people, you'd feel pretty special. So here's another part of that. He returned to England after the King Henry died and Edward VI was put on the throne. He returned to England because he could. The Protestants had sway, and Edward, even though he was young, was tutored by the Protestants, and he was his own man, and he decided he was going to be Protestant. So, and of course, within the Church of England. Miles Coverdale became the Bishop of Exeter during Edward VI's reign. That was 7 years of reign before he died. Edward VI died supposedly of tuberculosis on 6 July 1553. Shortly before he died, he had attempted to deter a Roman Catholic revival by switching the succession from Mary to Lady Jane Grey. So Bloody Mary was up for the throne if anything happened to him. And so he put official letter out through his archbishops and through his chancellors that said, if anything happens to me, then I want Lady Jane Grey, who was the last wife of Henry, to be the queen, and not Mary, who was the official bloodline successor. And that because all of the Greys were devout Protestants, and he didn't want it to go back to being a Catholic country. And so that's another reason why scholars believe that Mary had him poisoned to death instead of just him dying of tuberculosis. He was probably poisoned to the point where he couldn't breathe anymore and his organs were shutting down. And back in those days, they just said, oh, it was consumption. It was tuberculosis. So after a brief struggle between the opposing factions, Mary was proclaimed Queen of England on the 19th of July, and that was in 1553. So several weeks after he came out with the edict that he didn't want Bloody Mary to get on the throne, he mysteriously went ahead and died. So you remember what we're talking about. King Henry, this is his mother, Jane Seymour. Am I getting that right? No.
Mother of Edward is Jane.
Yeah, right. And then and Edward. And so he dies young, and Bloody Mary takes over. So Coverdale was summoned almost immediately to appear before the Privy Council, and on 1 September he was placed under house arrest in Exeter. And on 18 September he was ejected from his see and again fled the country with his wife. The reason he was allowed to go, even though he was now under arrest and was headed for the stake, his wife was a niece to the King of Norway. And they got all of the guys that were representative, the ambassadors, that's what I'm trying to think of, the ambassadors from Norway and Sweden, which were then together under the same king, to come to England. And because Mary wanted to be accepted by all the people, she let him go to Norway. She said, we can let Coverdale go to Norway. That's all right. He'll be out of our hair. Well, he worked his way back into the main part of the continent there. So Tyndale escaped to the continent with Coverdale escaped to the continent with Tyndale's work. And of course, we talked last week about during that same time, John Rogers was martyred by Bloody Mary. So, what happened was Coverdale worked his way back to Switzerland, to Geneva, Switzerland. That was the only place where there was real freedom in its neutrality to be able to house the reformers, and they could go about their business and go about their lives. And so I'm showing you the Geneva Bible here because Miles Coverdale, with all of his knowledge with Tyndale and knowledge of Lutheranism and Luther's writings and all of that, was on the team along with John Calvin, William Whittingham, and John Knox as the team that put together the Geneva Bible. And so it's our Protestant Bible, but it was the first homeschool Bible. It was the first teaching Bible, because in all the margins and in the introductory notes and in the sub-notes, you had all of these thoughts from the Greek and Hebrew by people like Martin Luther and Miles Coverdale and John Calvin. And that's why later on King James said to his scholars that were putting together the King James Bible, I'd rather you use any other source than that Geneva Bible. I hate that Geneva Bible, because it was the Bible that said the royalty must always give in to the people of the church, because the people of the church, represented by their churchmen, are God's people, and they are going by God's will. And if they insist on something, the king should bow to their will. Well, King James wasn't about to bow to anybody's will, so that's why he didn't like that Geneva Bible. But we're going to talk, as we finish up this series, about these other three. Next week, John Calvin, and then William Whittingham, that you probably never heard of, and John Knox, which you may have heard of. So, why did all these people go to Switzerland to finally put together a study Bible? The first study Bible for the average man in English. And it was because Switzerland was neutral. Now, Switzerland has always remained neutral since then. We know that down to this very day. But basically, back in those days, it was a mountainous backwater. And the Pope said, who wants it anyway? Let those reformers have it. They can have Switzerland. And let's keep them all bottled up in there, and we can keep everything the way we like it. Because all of this area was heavily Catholic. All of this area was heavily Catholic. And this area was moderate Catholic, and this area was heavily Catholic, and then you got the Islamists all down in here. And so Switzerland was the tiny little place where God was planting the seeds of a study Bible that all subsequent study Bibles today have come from and through, except the Catholic one. So, why were they there? In 1542, a couple of decades before this, Paul III, who was Pope at that time, came up with the Supreme Inquisition. You remember they had the Spanish Inquisition in the late 1400s, and then early 1500s it was more of a general European Inquisition. And so as time went on, they had a full system of this Inquisition and how it worked. Paul III's pontificate initiated the Counter-Reformation with the Council of Trent in 1545, as well as the Wars of Religion with Emperor Charles V's military campaigns against the Protestants in Germany. So you had the Catholics who were being supplied by the Spanish, who were being supplied by the Italians, and they were being all marshaled through France to come against the armies of Martin Luther's people, the German armies. And so that's the wars that we're talking about with Charles V, because Charles V was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But his whole family was from Spain. He was a Spaniard, half Spaniard, half lowlands bred and born. And he utilized all of that Holy Roman Empire power. And so Switzerland was where they were. And get the picture of how this happened. In the Supreme Inquisition, Paul III said, and we've got this literally in a letter, through the confession, seek out any leads to those who read, possessed, bought, or sold prohibited materials or associated with Protestants. And those confessors who gave such names would receive 1/4 of the confiscated goods of certain persons. So you could go in and you could say, I'd love to have my neighbor's land, or at least to have the church there instead of some guy I don't like. He's a Protestant, and here I found this on the border between our two properties. The Inquisition would come in there, would question the guy, would convict him, would burn him at the stake or exile him, take all of his property, and would give 1/4 to the person who, in confession to a priest, gave the guy away, whether he was guilty or not. That's how they worked it. And so this is evil. This is the face of evil right here. So let's kind of put all this together, finish it up about Coverdale. On the 29th of November, 1558, in Geneva, Coverdale was made godfather to John Knox's son. That's how close they were as a team putting together the Geneva Bible. 16 December, he became an elder of the English Church in Geneva, where he was a team member working on the Geneva Bible. In August 1559, after Bloody Mary's death, Coverdale and his wife returned to London. So this was, he'd been exiled or had exiled himself twice. But he's back in London now in 1559. And from 1564 to 1566, he was Church of England rector near the London Bridge. We have that. We don't really have what he did from 1559 to 1564. I would have loved to have known some of that. But we do have this in the official records. And after the summer of 1566, when he had to resign his last living, remember they were paid for by the government because it was the state church. But he had to resign. He was once again being too reformist, now this time against the Church of England for not coming too far enough to what the Bible said. Coverdale became popular in early Puritan circles. So Coverdale went round to all the different Puritan churches and preached from his understanding, from all these great giants, from Martin Luther, from John Tyndale, from John Knox, John Calvin. He had all of this, and he went around preaching and was allowed to preach to the Puritans in their house gatherings and in their small meeting gatherings in middle northern England and Scotland. But due to his, because of his quiet but firm stance against ceremonies and elaborate clerical dress in the Church of England, he said we should all be brothers and sisters. We shouldn't have all this elaborate stuff where the priest is separated from the people, etc. And they didn't like that, of course, because that's their power base. If I can wear a long robe and be up before you and in front of you and I can tell you what to do, then I have power. But you take that away from me and I'm up in some kind of vest or whatever this thing is, then I lose my power over you. They couldn't afford that. They got their living out of that. They got their big houses out of that and all the riches that they came to. Due to his opposition to official Church of England practices, he died in poverty aged 81 on 20 January 1569. This guy could have gone, he could have written more books, he could have gone on Oprah, he could have gone on all of these other, talk shows and news shows, and he could have made a good living for himself by just going along with the Church of England. But in his old age, what did he do in his last 10 or 15 years of life, getting toward 80 years old? He said, you guys still aren't doing right, and I'm all about what's right. And according to what the Bible says from the original languages. And so this is why he was not allowed to stay in his rectory. He was not allowed to stay in the Church of England, and he died only a guy going around to Puritan homes telling them the word of the truth of God in poverty as he died. So that's the basic story that we can tell in half an hour about Miles Coverdale. Next week, we're going to go back to Geneva, Switzerland, and we're going to study about a guy that you all most probably know of. His name is John Calvin, and he came out with what's called the Institutes of the Christian Religion. The systematic theology, the basics of the true Church of Jesus Christ is what he called it. God's total sovereignty and salvation by faith alone. And that's where we'll pick it up next time we meet. Let me pray for us.